Welcome, utterly exhausted traveller, to a journey through the sands of time. As the stars wheel overhead, or the glow of your phone barely illuminates the room, silently judging your late-night habits, I invite you to finally rest that magnificent head of yours. Let your imagination gently drift to a land of endless sand, colossal stones, a mighty river, and towering, pointy structures that still baffle engineers today. This is ancient Egypt, a civilization of mind-boggling wonder, profound mystery, and, if we're being completely, utterly honest, a frankly absurd amount of daily hardship, relentless struggle, and a surprising quantity of just plain ick factor. Ancient Egypt looms large in our collective consciousness, doesn't it? We picture soaring monuments that scrape the heavens, golden masked kings, so blinged out they'd make modern rappers blush, the profound and slightly gross secrets of mummification. Popular media, bless its romantic heart, has painted a rather charming picture. Perfectly symmetrical pyramids shimmering under a perpetually blue sky. Nobility draped in impossibly fine linen and glittering jewels. Casually cruising down the Nile like it's a giant, slow-moving luxury yacht. But while Egypt's accomplishments were, without a doubt, absolutely staggering, the breathtaking precision and sheer scale of the Great Pyramids. Seriously, how did they do that without forklifts or a decent cup of coffee? Was it aliens? It's always aliens, right? The sublime artistry of their temples and tombs, the mind-boggling sophistication of their writing, their astronomy, their dentistry. Yes, really dentistry. We must, in our quiet honesty, remember a crucial and frankly deeply uncomfortable truth. These marvels, these wonders that have stood for millennia, were constructed on the bent backs, calloused hands, and shattered dreams of multitudes. For every pharaoh who was probably lounging in an opulent palace, thousands upon thousands of Egyptians were out there. They were toiling under a merciless sun in fields, sweating profusely in dusty workshops, and let's not forget, fighting endless, brutal wars. Their lives were, by any modern standard, frequently difficult, often dangerous, and spoiler alert for anyone hoping for a happy ending, tragically, painfully short. In the unforgiving, often oven-like environment of the Nile River Valley, sheer existence was a precarious tightrope walk over a pit of scorpions. The annual floods, which were supposed to be Egypt's lifeline, could, with equal ease, decide to simply wipe out entire villages and seed massive, agonizing famines. The very same blazing sun that meticulously baked the mud bricks for those majestic monuments also relentlessly scorched the labourers who stacked them ever skyward, probably giving them third-degree sunburns and chronic dehydration. From the lowliest barefoot servant to the loftiest, most impeccably dressed scribe, life in ancient Egypt was simply rife with adversity. So, dear listener, gather your inner fortitude and join me as we bravely part the shimmering curtains of romance and nostalgic idealization. We'll peek behind the scenes to glimpse the stark, often gritty realities faced by the very real men, women, and even children who built and sustained this dazzling yet utterly brutal civilization. We'll be exploring 6 utterly delightful key aspects of Egyptian life that, when you really get down to it, made it a constant, soul-crushing struggle for survival. The oppressive social hierarchy. Because nothing says fun like being born into a system where your life expectancy is inversely proportional to your annual income. The grind of forced labour. Think of it as ancient community service, but with more whips and absolutely no safety regulations. The ravages of war, where the greatest danger wasn't dying heroically, but becoming a gruesome anonymous footnote. The dangers lurking in their own homes. Spoiler alert, it wasn't just dust bunnies under the beds. Try scorpions, venomous snakes, and the occasional disgruntled neighbour, the spectre of sickness and injury. Because an apple a day keeps the doctor away definitely wasn't catching on. The ever-present sting of grief. When burying your dead was less about finding closure and more about an anxiety-ridden gamble. The mighty Nile has, for millennia, been reverently called Egypt's greatest blessing, and honestly, it's hard to argue. It was the singular source of the incredibly fertile black soil and the abundant water that allowed such a sophisticated civilization to not just survive, but to truly flourish in an otherwise bone-dry, utterly unforgiving desert. But living at the constant mercy of the river's unpredictable and often dramatic cycles could be a truly harrowing, anxiety-inducing experience. Each summer, with the precision of a cosmic alarm clock, the Nile would surge furiously over its banks, swollen with torrential monsoon rains and snowmelt. The floodwaters would then dramatically drown the surrounding fields and pastures. Farmers would watch nervously as the murky, fast-moving tide lapped ominously at their thresholds, probably gnawing on their fingernails, fervently praying to the god Happy to halt the deluge just before it could sweep away their precious homes and all their worldly possessions, not to mention their very lives. But here's the exquisitely painful kicker. They desperately needed that flood. For it carried tons of incredibly fertile Ethiopian silt, a black, nutrient-rich blessing, which would settle and replenish their fields. In a good year, the inundation would majestically recede by autumn, leaving behind a thick, glorious layer of that black, fertile mud. Farmers, undoubtedly exhausted but relieved, would then fling seed into this rich soil, eventually reaping bountiful harvests of wheat, barley, and various vegetables. But the Nile, oh the Nile, was fickle. Sometimes the floods were embarrassingly anemic, barely wetting the lips of a parched, cracked landscape. The crops would then shrivel miserably, leaving the terrifying, skeletal spectre of famine looming. Other times, the river would surge far too high, turning into a watery monster, drowning newly sprouted seedlings, precious livestock, and unlucky villagers. It was, in essence, a watery roulette wheel of doom. The very first pharaoh of a unified Egypt, the legendary King Narmer, learned this particular hard lesson around 3000 BC. When one summer, the Nile's flood failed utterly, crops withered and herds wasted away. His subjects began to starve, probably looking at him with increasingly accusatory eyes. Narmer, in a moment of extreme desperation, even ordered that a young virgin be hurled into the Nile as a desperate offering. Still, the river mockingly shrank. At last, utterly defeated, Narmer undertook a pilgrimage to the sacred island of Elephantine, vowing to dedicate his entire realm to the Nile's glory, if only Happy would bless Egypt with waters once more. Whether by divine intervention or incredibly fortunate timing, the rains finally came. The Nile swelled, and Egypt was delivered from utter disaster. The harsh, uncompromising realities of daily life in ancient Egypt extended, perhaps unsurprisingly, to their deeply ingrained beliefs about the afterlife. The Egyptians were, to put it mildly, absolutely obsessed with death and what came after. They believed that upon shuffling off this mortal coil, their souls would embark upon a truly harrowing, utterly terrifying journey through the underworld, a realm brimming with fearsome monsters, insidious traps, and perilous tests. Only then, after surviving that veritable gauntlet of trauma, could they hopefully reach the paradise of the Field of Reeds. But even this idyllic reward was not guaranteed. The deceased's heart, which they believed contained the entire soul and intellect, would be weighed on a colossal scale against the delicate feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth. If the heart was heavier, weighed down by sin, it would be unceremoniously devoured by the truly terrifying demon Amit. Amit was not your average cuddly pet. This beast had the head of a crocodile, the front legs of a lion, and the back legs of a hippopotamus. To be consumed by Amit meant to die a second, final death, vanishing into oblivion for all eternity. As a direct result of this rather intense existential threat, Egyptians devoted enormous energy, staggering amounts of resources, and countless hours towards ensuring a successful, drama-free passage. Tombs and burial chambers were meticulously prepared, then lavishly stocked with an almost absurd array of grave goods: food, furniture, jewelry, and occasionally even actual servants. All the necessities they believed they would need for a comfortable eternity. The walls were painted with intricate spells and inscriptions directly from the Book of the Dead, designed to guide and protect the deceased on their perilous underworld journey. The most crucial and perhaps most aromatic step was mummification. Egyptians firmly believed that the soul needed an earthly physical body to return to. So, after death, the corpse would undergo an extensive, slightly horrifying, and definitely smelly embalming process to preserve it for eternity. The internal organs were carefully removed, the body meticulously dried in salts, then finally wrapped in countless layers of fine linen soaked in various resins. Even for the wealthy, this sacred, albeit slightly grotesque, rite was an incredibly expensive, painstakingly lengthy and complex procedure, often lasting up to 70 days. Perhaps the most extravagant example was King Tutankhamun, the famed boy king, who, sadly, ruled for a mere blink of an eye in the 14th century BC. Although he died unexpectedly at the tender age of only 19, he was still interred in a multi-chambered, treasure-filled tomb in the remote and seemingly secure Valley of the Kings. Over 5,000 precious objects were buried with him, including 6 chariots, multiple thrones, and a magnificent solid gold death mask. When Howard Carter unsealed Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, the dazzling treasures captivated the entire world. But they also reflected the Egyptians' endless, desperate efforts to secure their fragile shot at eternal life. The chilling fear of tomb robbery was a constant, nagging spectre. Egyptians tried everything: cleverly hidden entrances, cunning false doors, confusing passages, impossibly deep shafts, and decoy chambers, all to thwart increasingly audacious thieves. They even had armed guards posted, and devoted priests made offerings to the deceased kings daily. Elaborately worded curses were carved into the very walls, invoking the terrifying wrath of the gods. And with exceedingly good reason. The punishments for grave robbing were, by far, among the most brutal in Egyptian law. Convicted tomb raiders faced truly horrific executions, their bodies then deliberately denied proper burial, specifically designed to doom their own hopes for the afterlife. The ancient Greek historian Diodorus Siculus recounts the grim story of robbers being roasted to death over a slow fire as a deterrent. Even the vast, intricately hidden cemeteries and secret tomb shafts couldn't ultimately stop the relentless tide of robberies. During the chaotic reign of Ramesses IX in the 12th century BC, tomb raiding had grown so brazen that the king dispatched a special royal commission to investigate. A scribe named Amun-Panafer found mummies of great kings and queens of the past cast out of their magnificent coffins, stripped of jewels, their unwrapped corpses left twisted and mouldering. Even the mummy of the mighty Ramesses II had been vandalized, his precious eyes pried out. The confession of one gold worker, Amun-Panafer, revealed the sheer audacity of these ancient smash-and-grab artists. The robbers seemed utterly undeterred by the risk of divine retribution or gruesome execution. The glittering golden allure was just too tempting. On the shifting, often deadly sands of the Nile, life was fraught with uncertainty, backbreaking hardship, and casual brutality. Even for powerful pharaohs like Thutmose III, who reigned in the 15th century BC, danger and struggle were never far away. Thutmose, often hailed as the Napoleon of Egypt, was one of Egypt's greatest warrior kings, leading an astonishing 17 military campaigns. He fought relentlessly to expand Egypt's empire and secure its borders, venturing into Canaan to confront his enemies. Campaigning, even for a pharaoh who thought he was basically a god, was incredibly difficult and dangerous. Thutmose and his men faced grueling marches through the scorching Sinai desert. Water was scarce, and heat exhaustion took a heavy toll. At the fortified city of Megiddo, Thutmose faced a crucial strategic decision. He chose the incredibly risky, narrow, winding mountain pass that led directly to Megiddo, a veritable death trap. As the Egyptians threaded their way through the narrow pass, the Canaanites attacked, raining arrows and boulders down, but Thutmose urged his army forward, eventually spilling onto the plain and meeting the full Canaanite coalition in open, brutal battle. The clash was long, incredibly bloody, but Thutmose's military skill won the day. The Battle of Megiddo was a decisive victory, but the larger war was far from over. The surviving Canaanites took refuge behind the city's thick walls. Thutmose immediately laid siege, but his men were hungry, exhausted, and battle-weary. So he ordered a massive wooden palisade, an impenetrable fence, constructed around the entire city, cutting off any escape. This daunting project required thousands of trees to be felled and transported. Trapped inside, hunger, thirst, and disease took their inevitable toll on the Canaanites. After 7 long, miserable months, Megiddo finally capitulated. Thutmose entered the city, claiming its riches. The siege of Megiddo vividly illustrates the hardships and sheer brutality of ancient warfare. During the long months of encirclement, Thutmose's men faced short rations, rampant sickness, and the constant threat of enemy raids. They were far from home, camped in a hostile land, not knowing if they would live to see their families again. Even in triumph, they coped with the gruesome aftermath: rotting corpses, devastated fields, and the stench of death. The constant, insatiable need for manpower to fuel these ambitious conquests and monumental building projects led to a stark increase in forced labor and widespread conscription. For the average Egyptian peasant, being drafted into the army, or, even worse, a royal work gang, was a deeply traumatic, life-altering experience. It meant leaving behind family and home, marching hundreds of miles, and enduring the brutal dangers and soul-crushing drudgery. Many were simply worked to death under the harsh sun. We get a chilling glimpse of this reality from the tomb inscription of Amenemheb, an army officer who served with Thutmose III. He recounts the unrelenting hardships of campaign and describes a grisly battle where his unit had to clamber over piles of enemy corpses. In another passage, he casually tells of how Thutmose ordered the severed hands of slain foes to be piled before him as a grim accounting of the day's killing. These were the bloody receipts of empire. The inhabitants of conquered lands were also treated with staggering cruelty. Cities that dared to resist were ruthlessly burned to the ground, their people murdered or dragged off into slavery. Prisoners of war were routinely beaten, tortured, and often executed in public spectacles. Thutmose III described razing the city of Jaffa, then, chillingly, sowing it with barley and hanging its chief in front of the city that had been his. Such terroristic displays were brutally effective, designed to instill obedience through raw fear. For the average Egyptian peasant, whose back literally built the empire, little real benefit came from all this bloodshed. Most remained stubbornly mired in grinding poverty, tirelessly toiling as peasant farmers or faceless labourers. Even in rare times of peace, life was a constant, exhausting struggle for mere survival. And that struggle, my friends, began not with a glorious sunrise, but with the very moment of birth. For an ancient Egyptian child, the odds of living to see anything resembling adulthood were crushingly, heart-wrenchingly slim. It is estimated that as many as 1 in 3 infants died before their very first birthday. Those tiny souls who somehow, miraculously, made it out of infancy still had to run a harrowing daily gauntlet of chronic malnutrition, unavoidable accidents, relentless infections, and a veritable ecosystem of parasites. Only about half of all children lived past the tender age of 5. The stark evidence can be found in the cemeteries of ancient Egyptian villages, where tiny, heartbreakingly common graves are an almost constant, grim reminder. Childbirth itself was an incredibly dangerous, frequently lethal event for both mother and child. Without modern medicine, many women died in labour from hemorrhage, eclampsia, or obstructed birth. Midwives used spells and ritual techniques that did little to improve actual medical outcomes. Even royal women were not immune. Several of Thutmose III's own wives and daughters tragically died in childbirth. Such rampant infant and childhood mortality was so omnipresent that Egyptians often deliberately avoided naming their babies for the first few months of life, fearing becoming too attached to a child who might soon perish. The Egyptians, in their eternal hope, believed that the dead needed to be meticulously provisioned for the afterlife. So even the youngest children were often buried with miniature combs, tiny pots, and poignant toy figurines. These small, heartfelt grave goods reflect the desperate effort to care for the child's spirit. In some rare, touching cases, infants were mummified with the same lavish care given to adults, a testament to profound grief. We know of a case where a young mother died in childbirth along with her baby, and someone took great pains to mummify the two together, carefully posing the infant at its mother's breast, as if peacefully nursing for eternity. And those children, lucky enough to survive infancy, still faced countless perils. Most were put to work at a very young age, often as soon as they could walk, helping in the fields, tending meagre livestock, or learning a demanding craft. Education, true education beyond basic survival skills, was a rare and precious privilege, almost exclusively limited to the children of the elite. For most commoners, childhood was simply a brief prelude to a life that was a constant, exhausting struggle to avoid hunger, to pay relentless taxes, and to placate the arbitrary demands of their overseers. The Nile's annual capricious flood was the absolute engine that drove Egyptian agriculture, the very pulse of their civilization. But it was also an incredibly unreliable and, often, utterly destructive master. If the waters rose too high, they could wash away entire villages, drowning not just people, but also their precious, life-sustaining livestock. If the waters receded too soon, or failed to come at all, the crops would tragically wither and die, leading inevitably to widespread, agonizing famine. Even a slight fluctuation could spell utter disaster for thousands. One such devastating famine, etched in stone, is recorded by the noble Ankh-Tifi, who lived during the chaotic First Intermediate Period. Ankh-Tifi's account describes a harrowing time of soaring grain prices, rampant looting, and starving peasants from the north invading his province in a desperate search for food. He boasts of feeding his own people while turning away the hungry hordes, even as they literally dropped dead at his feet. The whole land has become like locusts going in search of food. The people in the village are coming to my territory with their children on their backs to get grain here to live. I am the one who buries those who died on the road out of fear of the royal anger. For these hapless refugees, dying on the roadside from hunger was apparently preferable to returning home and facing the king's terrifying wrath. Localized famines and chronic food shortages were distressingly common, even in the best of times. Pests like relentless locusts could consume as much as a quarter of the entire harvest, and the constant, immense pressure to hand over a sizable portion of their precious crop to the state in taxes left many farmers on the knife's edge of subsistence. Many inevitably fell into crippling debt, and were then cruelly forced to surrender their meagre plots of land to powerful, avaricious landlords. Court records show an endless litany of foreclosures, with whole families effectively taken into bond servitude, a form of debt slavery. These debt slaves could be bought, sold, or rented out like any other property. Their dependent status offered them little to no recourse against abuse. Even for Egyptians who, through sheer luck or hard work, owned their own land, the relentless demands of corvée labour could be crushing. During the flood season, when the fields were underwater, peasants were often conscripted, without choice, to work on the pharaoh's monumental, ego-driven building projects. This forced labour was theoretically a form of in-kind taxation, but it frequently devolved into outright slavery. The work itself was back-breaking, hauling incredibly heavy loads of mud, stone, and sheer misery under the scorching, unrelenting sun. Men literally dropped from exhaustion, were crushed by falling blocks, or simply worked to death, their bodies tossed aside like discarded tools. We can see the undeniable human toil in the archaeological ruins of the workers' village near the colossal Giza pyramids. Skeletons found there show severe, debilitating arthritis, a sure sign of long hours spent bent under heavy loads. Many have fractured limbs that healed crookedly, a painful mark of primitive medical care. In one mass grave at Giza, archaeologists found the remains of a woman still clutching her infant child. Both had clearly died on the job, likely from exhaustion, and both bore the unmistakable marks of severe malnutrition. So, for all its undeniable glories and breathtaking wonders, Life in ancient Egypt was more often than not nasty, brutish, and tragically short, especially for those unlucky souls at the very bottom of the great social pyramid. They faced a constant, daily struggle against the unforgiving elements, soul-crushing labour, relentless hunger, terrifying disease, and a rigid, almost impenetrable social hierarchy that kept them firmly in their place. Even many nobles and priests, who seemed to have it easy, led lives of surprising precarity, constantly jockeying for position and favour, always in danger of losing status. Perhaps that is why, despite their enduring reputation for conservatism, their meticulous adherence to order, the Egyptians displayed a remarkable, almost defiant fascination with the transgressive and chaotic. The tombs of the elite, surprisingly, are filled with vivid, often humorous images of animals and humans behaving in utterly strange, unnatural ways. Cats herding geese, mice bravely waging war on cats. Such scenes are genuinely humorous, designed to bring a smile, but they also evoke a profound, unsettling vision of a world turned upside down. One particularly darkly comic papyrus satirically depicts the gods themselves as a fractious, petty bunch, constantly squabbling, getting gloriously drunk, and even ordering Ra to flay his divine guests for sandals. Such irreverent stories, such playful subversions, allowed the Egyptians to safely transgress the sacred order, to imagine, if only for a fleeting moment, a different reality. Even the Egyptian concept of the afterlife bears the unmistakable imprint of their uniquely precarious existence. In a world where starvation, disease, and sudden death were always terrifyingly close at hand, the field of reeds offered an inverted, idealized mirror image, a glorious utopian landscape of lush, endlessly bountiful crops and eternal abundance where no one ever went hungry, suffered pain, or had to pay taxes. It was a perfect anti-Egypt. But this perfect afterlife, of course, was not guaranteed. It had to be meticulously earned through proper observance of countless rituals, adherence to the moral code, and, crucially, absolute obedience to the gods and the omnipresent king. Even for those judged worthy, the path to paradise was harrowing, a final, terrifying trial through the underworld, evading treacherous lakes of fire and the slavering jaws of Ammit. Now, you might be thinking by this point that life in ancient Egypt was nothing but misery, death, and existential dread. But hold on, the Egyptian civilization is also renowned for its truly remarkable medical knowledge. For the time, they had a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of the human body. However, despite their progress, Egyptian medicine was still quite primitive, and many procedures were gruesome. Much of what we know comes from the Edwin Smith Papyrus, dating back to around 1600 BC. This incredible text details 48 surgical cases and provides astonishing insights. One striking case describes complex cranial surgery performed on a patient with a severe skull fracture. The ancient surgeon meticulously extracted broken bone shards from the man's head using primitive tools, all without anesthesia or sterile techniques. The excruciating pain and risk of infection are almost unimaginable. Yet, somehow, the patient survived. The papyrus describes disinfecting the wound with honey and binding it with fresh meat, then declares, "Thou should say, an ailment which I will treat." It makes you incredibly grateful for modern neurosurgeons. Beyond the grand narratives of pharaohs and wars, the daily life for the vast majority of Egyptians was a relentless, monotonous grind. Imagine waking up in a tiny mudbrick hut, probably shared with your extended family. A few chickens, and myriad unwelcome pests. Sanitation was rudimentary. Waste was often simply dumped into the street or the Nile, leading to a constant battle against disease. The air would have been thick with dust, the smell of animals, and unwashed humanity. Food, while a major concern, wasn't gourmet. The staple diet was primarily bread and beer. Even children drank a weaker version, as it was often safer than contaminated water. Vegetables like onions, garlic, and lentils, along with occasional fish, supplemented this basic fare. Meat was a rare luxury. Imagine eating essentially the same bland meal, day in and day out, with no refrigeration, and the constant threat of your harvest being eaten by locusts or claimed by taxes. And speaking of taxes, the ancient Egyptians were masters of bureaucracy. Every grain harvested, every animal raised, every piece of cloth woven was meticulously recorded and taxed. Scribes, the ancient world's accountants, were everywhere, diligently tallying the pharaoh's due. This meant endless paperwork, constant inspections, and the ever-present threat of official displeasure if your numbers didn't add up. Even simply living in your own home came with natural dangers. Scorpions, hidden in the cracks of mudbrick walls, delivered painful, often fatal, stings. Venomous snakes slithered through fields and homes. And the mighty Nile, while life-giving, was teeming with crocodiles and hippos, both incredibly dangerous. Your home was less a sanctuary and more a fortified position against a world that seemed determined to kill you. The unseen enemies, sickness, injury, and the smell of ancient doctors. We've touched on ancient Egyptian medicine, but let's delve a little deeper into the constant threat of sickness and injury that plagued their lives. Without understanding germs, basic hygiene was sorely lacking. Open wounds easily became infected. Waterborne diseases like dysentery and typhoid were rampant. Parasites were a constant companion. Life expectancy was, predictably, incredibly low. If you made it to 40, you were basically a senior citizen. Archaeological evidence from mummies and skeletal remains paints a grim picture. Many show signs of chronic diseases, severe dental problems, and recurring infections. Arthritis was incredibly common from heavy labor. Spinal deformities and broken bones that healed badly are frequent finds. Imagine living with chronic pain, without ibuprofen. Your best bet for pain relief might have been a spell, or a strong herbal concoction that mostly just made you very sleepy. The sheer prevalence of death and disease meant that grief was a constant, unwelcome visitor in every home. Funerary practices, while elaborate and hopeful, were also deeply rooted in the raw, personal pain of loss. Families would mourn publicly and dramatically, often employing professional mourners. The ritual of mummification, even for the poor, was an act of profound love and desperate hope against the finality of death. You weren't just burying a body, you were desperately trying to secure a future for their soul. Life in ancient Egypt, therefore, was not just about building impressive monuments. It was about the daily, exhausting, often terrifying struggle against the very forces of nature and the relentless march of time. It was a battle against hunger, thirst, disease, wild animals, and the constant demands of an all-powerful state. And yet, amidst all this brutality, the Egyptians created something truly remarkable. They carved their hopes, their fears, and their resilience into stone, leaving behind a legacy that continues to captivate us millennia later. A legacy of enduring against all odds, with a surprising amount of dark humour. And so, dear listener, our journey through the shifting sands and harsh realities of ancient Egypt draws to a close. We've seen a civilization of unparalleled wonder, built on the bent backs and aching muscles of millions. We've witnessed the fickle wrath of the Nile, the terrifying journey through the underworld, and the audacity of tomb robbers facing fiery, skewered deaths. We've glimpsed the brutal crucible of childhood, the relentless grip of famine and debt, and the ingenious, if sometimes horrifying, attempts at ancient medicine. It was a life of struggle, danger, and often profound sadness. The Egyptians, in their eternal quest for order and immortality, lived in a world where every sunrise brought new challenges, and every sunset brought the stark reality of how fragile life truly was. They faced down the gods, the elements, and each other, often with a stoic endurance that defies belief. And in their unique humour, their absurd drawings, and their intricate myths, we see a people who, despite everything, found ways to laugh, to hope, and to dream of a better existence, even if it was only in the field of reeds. For 3 millennia they persevered, built, suffered, and thrived in their own brutal, magnificent way. And as you now, hopefully, drift deeper into your own peaceful slumber, safe from plagues, pharaohs, and persistent tax collectors, take a moment to appreciate the immense distance between their world and ours. The soft pillow beneath your head, the steady temperature of your room, the quiet hum of modern life. These are luxuries unimaginable to the average ancient Egyptian. So, let the cares of your day, whatever they may be, truly slip away. The Nile has receded, the sun has set over distant cliffs, and for you, dear listener, the work is finally done. You have journeyed through the dust and despair of a brutal age, and now it is time for rest. Good night, and try not to dream of Amit or the taxman. Sweet dreams.